Welcome to the second of the Center for Excellence in Education AI series. My name is Arvind Parthasarathy. I was in RSI in a long time ago in the year 1990, and I am also have the honor of serving as a board of trustee for CEE. And I've been actually on the board for over 10 years now. So really had the opportunity of working with Mrs. D and Maite, over the last 10 years, just shaping the organization and the direction that they're going and working with the fellow trustees on doing that. I'm very excited to be the moderator of what I think is going to be a very fun and energetic session today. I wanted to first have the opportunity to have each of the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right into it. So I'll start off by doing a quick introduction of myself. My background is in technology. I've been in Silicon Valley the last 20 years. I was part of the management committee of a large public company, and then went off to do two startups that were acquired, and now I'm on my third startup. Sean?
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sean Canuck. I was RSI 88. I subsequently had the pleasure of being a teaching fellow at RSI and then serving on the board of trustees for a few years as well myself. Always been a fan and supporter of CEE. And my career is as an international attorney and as an intelligence analyst. I spent 11 years at CIA and 5 years at the Office of Director of National Intelligence, where my final position was as our first national intelligence officer for cyber issues. As of late, I've been doing some academic work through Stanford and elsewhere, and teaching in the DC area on the ethics of national security laws, as well as the security implications of artificial intelligence. So I'm delighted to be a part of this discussion, looking at these fascinating new technologies from a legal and ethical perspective as well. Thank you.
Percy?
Hi, everyone. My name is Percy Liang. I was RSI in 99. And I'm currently associate professor at Stanford University. I also direct the Center for Research on Foundation Models. I'm an academic researcher who's spent a lot of time thinking about issues in machine learning and natural language processing, how to get systems to understand language at a deeper level. I've also worked a lot on kind of robustness of machine learning, and more recently, inevitably encountering ethical issues. So I'm excited to be on this panel and discuss this more with you all.
Thank you. And Bistra?
Hi Everybody. My name is Bistra Dilkina. I'm an associate professor at the University of Southern California. I was at RSI in 96. I'm from Bulgaria originally, so for me, I was one of the international students. First time out of Bulgaria, first time on a plane, first time hearing about AI, actually thinking about what do I want to do when I come to RSI. I just looked up the mentors, bios and so on. I was really interested in math and programming to begin with, but then I discovered this idea about AI, that people at MIT were doing AI, and that RSI really kind of opened my mind to this field. So I'm really, really happy to be here and be talking about to all of you today. So my area of research is fusing ideas from machine learning and discrete optimization in order to provide new tools for decision making. And in particular, I am very passionate of applying AI to sustainability and other applications in sustainable development. So using AI to inform decision makers on the ground or policy makers about how best to preserve habitat in order to protect biodiversity, or using AI about how to upgrade critical infrastructures in order to have better disaster resilience. So in my work, I developed this new subfield of AI called computational sustainability, where the goal is to really galvanize computer scientists to try to think about how to use their amazing skill set, in particular in AI, to think about making an impact in applications related to sustainable development, work with stakeholders and with real data, and understand which solutions apply, what new solutions are needed, etc. So really looking forward to talking today on this theme.
Thank you. So we'll just jump right into it. And I think we're actually going to start with two polling questions that I hope will set the stage for the discussion. And I'll hand it over to Sean to introduce the two questions as you're all looking at it on the screen in front of you.
Hi, everybody. We've got a diverse audience here today. And we're interested in polling you just for your gut reactions to 2 ethically charged questions before we have our discussion. So please do read ahead and answer these 2 questions while I'm talking here for a minute or 2. The first question obviously is about criminal justice. And increasingly, we're seeing proposals to use automated machine learning tools in the criminal justice system. And the question here gives you a range of options about who you would want to be sentenced by if you were a criminal defendant who was found guilty. The sentencing phase of a legal process is, of course, where the length or duration or nature of your punishment is determined. Historically, that was by a judge, but increasingly there were statutory guidelines, and now there are technical assistant tools that are being implemented. So please do read those options and pick one. And then the second question is about autonomous vehicles, better known as driverless cars. And the question is, in the event of an adverse situation, an imminent accident, what kind of software programming would you want for the driverless vehicle? Whose life would you want it to prioritize? And we've given you a series of options there. Of course, there's also the option of, save the most lives versus the least number, but we haven't given you just that utilitarian option or numerical option. We're making it difficult and have you select what kind of life you would want to value over others. So again, obviously a little social and moral philosophy there. Please do answer those questions. And we'll talk a little bit more about some real life examples that might pertain to them in a moment or 2. And to the administrator, I'd give them, maybe another 60 seconds to pick their choices, one choice for each question.
Also, you might need to scroll down to see all the options of answers for number 2.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bistra. Yes, for those not familiar with Zoom, please do use the scroll on the far right to get the full range of options.
Okay, so I think we have closed the polling, and so while it might take us a little bit more time to put the results out.
Yeah, let me, here we go. All right. So for question 1, very few of us want the traditional answer. Unfortunately, the judiciary has been male dominated for many years historically, and only 3% of you think that would be the right call. Several of you would want a judge with a more diverse background. Very few of you want a pure algorithm. And about a third of you think the suggestion of a human judge who's informed by an AI suggestion. Very interesting. And then for the vehicle, we see a favoring primarily of the car and its own passengers. All right, well, Arvind, can I jump to some real life examples that relate to these?
Yes, please.
All right, folks, we're going to take the polling questions in the opposite order because, quite frankly, the 59% of you who wanted an autonomous vehicle that favors its own passengers, that is exactly what several of the world's leading car companies have decided. And in fact, they decided that back in 2015 and 2016. In the chat that you should all be able to access, we don't have open chat for everyone to contribute, but I've placed a couple links. The second one is an article from Car and Driver magazine dating back to 2016, and it talks about the representatives of Mercedes-Benz, the very prominent German auto manufacturer, who decided that all of their autonomous vehicles would favor the passengers of their own vehicles. Now, if any of you have studied social or moral philosophy in your studies, you may have heard the term Philippa Foot, a very famous social philosopher who coined the term for a very challenging scenario called the trolley problem, where she had a theoretical railroad track that you had to pick which spur you would send the train down, and she would alternatively put different individuals on each side of the track. So you were making life and death decisions of a moral nature for other people. Sometimes it was numerical, sometimes it would be an evil despot on one side and 3 small babies on the other side. But what we really come down to is that was a theoretical project when Ms. Foote presented it to the philosophical community. Today, it's real. This is actually what the software engineers coding the software for driverless cars are having to put into that technology. If a car is driving with a passenger in it who is either not engaged at all in the future, a level 5 autonomous vehicle, or who is given over the primary role to the vehicle, a level 3 autonomous vehicle, and the small child runs into the street to chase a ball, okay? What is the car gonna do? Is it going to swerve and hit a light post, possibly killing the person in the car? Or is it gonna continue forward and have an adverse consequence for the young child who's now entered the street? And what the car companies have decided, and what 59% of you are recommending, is to actually proceed forward at the risk to the pedestrian. Now, I'm not here to chastise anyone or criticize an auto manufacturer, but hopefully part of our discussion here today will be about these very difficult questions, ethical and moral questions, that are now a part of software programming in our real lives. The second example about sentencing speaks to the inherent bias of AI algorithms, both based on the individuals who code them, because none of us can escape our own personal histories and personal biases, even if we do something that's technology oriented, like software programming, or the data itself that these algorithms are trained on, whether it's facial recognition or predictive policing algorithms, they all have to be trained on data. And garbage in is garbage out. There are a couple real life examples of, for example, the Los Angeles Police Department trying to use an AI algorithm for predictive policing. And because it was trained on that department's historical data, its results disproportionately recommended monitoring, stopping, and frisking ethnic minorities within the Los Angeles city. Now, just because a police department had a history of racism, that doesn't mean we want to perpetuate it through automated means. I've given you a second link, or actually what's the first link in the chat, is to a very interesting article dating back to 2020 from MIT Technology Review. And it gives examples not only from some of the police departments, but also from some of the corrections departments or the jail prison systems in several of the US states, and the challenges they faced with trying to apply automated methodologies to the criminal justice system. So by way of our polling, very tough questions. I'm not sure I would be able to tell you what the right or wrong answer is, but we've seen what our litmus test of our community here was. And we have two resources, at least, that I've shared with you. But as an ethicist and international lawyer, I think these are very difficult questions, and they're actually questions that we need to be discussing with the technologists, such that as we move forward with a more networked and AI-driven society and infrastructures, we're not blindly stepping into situations that we're not aware of. So I feel strongly that ethics need to be part of the curriculum for computer science and AI, and they need to be part of the developmental processes as well. And I'm delighted that we have two experts in those areas with us who are much more technological than myself. And I look forward to hearing their thoughts and learning from them on these and many other issues today. So thank you, and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Sean. And that kind of, as a software developer myself, I think the first takeaway that I have is it doesn't feel like there's a right answer to the question, or there's anybody's ability to find the right answer, but more about what is the process that we have to follow to get to these decisions. And Percy, I thought you could start us off in terms of how you think about that process and its decision process and its legitimacy.
Yeah, great. So one thing I wanted to react a little bit to Sean's comment about the trolley problems. I want to underscore that it's not the case that people are writing code where there's a place to put in the value of a baby and there's a value of the driver, and it's just like if an if statement, like if this is which one would I choose? I think it's actually worse than that, because I think these systems are operating kind of implicitly because they're based on machine learning. So just to kind of just to make sure we're on the same page here. So we have AI systems that are operating in these sort of complex real world environments, but largely the success of AI has been due to machine learning. And machine learning simply is taking some amount of data, having a model, and training the model to fit that data so that it can generalize to novel settings. And when you're learning, there's no specification of what the system even does. It's just learn from the data. And as Sean pointed out, if the data is biased, or then the algorithm can very well inherit those biases. So often in these self-driving situations, if you're training on data of people driving in the world, it's not that you always have a clear hook. Even if you want to state your values, I think it's very hard to. And that makes it even more difficult because the lack of transparency and interpretability makes it hard for humans to reason about the ethical consequences. So I'll just put that out there. And then going to Arvind's point about processes, I think this is a really important point that I think gets missed, because I think as I consider myself kind of as a technologist, and I for a long time I was purely thinking about how do you solve these problems, because in school you're often taught, well, you're solving problems and coming up with technical solutions, but as you when you're taking these polls, one reaction you might have is, this is completely unfair. Like, how am I supposed to choose one of these answers? None of them are good. And that's precisely the point. There are no good answers. There's no correct answer. And so what do you do in that case? It's not a technical solution. There's no magic answer that we just need to go search for. It's not a solution to a puzzle that we need to find. It's really about the process and the process is about how to weigh in together different voices. There's some legitimate reason for protecting the passengers in the car, or there's also a factor of not harming others, and often these are in conflict. And I think one issue is that who's making these decisions, and is that process legitimate? Well, often it's just some software engineer at a company making these decisions completely unilaterally by themselves, in its proprietary software. So there's no way of understanding even how the decision was made, and I would call that sort of not a particularly legitimate process, as opposed to having some sort of well-stated principles and some sort of maybe review board that looks at how these decisions are being encoded, regulation that says what are the limits of what you can and can't do. And that all that infrastructure is needed, I think, even if the end result is that we're still going with protecting the lives of the passengers, but at least it will have come from a process that was more robust, because in the future that might change, and we need a mechanism to. It's not about the actual decision, but the process by which the decision was made. So I think that's a very important point that I want everyone to think about.
Yeah, and just to add to this, I guess I think it's really important to have the structures, like the legal system around it, or the recommendations and the monitoring, etc. But also, and that's in a sense like something that is becoming more and more prevalent in our field, like really understand the repercussions of these systems as more and more AI systems are deployed in high stakes or social impact settings, right? So not to think of ourselves just as the technologies, or just as the programmers, just as the implementers of a piece, and then it's somebody else's responsibility to take care of the rest. Because often while you're implementing or designing a system, you're the one that's able to also maybe notice certain things that can be taken care of. And so I think more and more it should become part of our education, part of our process, to be thinking, for example, as a data scientist who is preparing the data that will go into a system like that, what could be wrong with this data? In which way can it be biased? As a person, let's say, developing the ML model, is thinking about like, what could go wrong with this? What kind of metrics should I be thinking about? And all of this cannot happen in isolation again. So it's really important to make sure that AI practitioners and researchers are aware and thoughtful and proactively thinking about the intersection between what they're doing and ethics and where things go wrong, and then be able to reach out to stakeholders, to other people that are involved in this process to make decisions and designs in a collaborative way, hearing different voices, different perspectives, and different expertise beyond, being, let's say, really good at machine learning or really good at programming, right? So like voices, for example, like Sean, who has completely different background than us, often have to be involved. And so it's important to have that in mind, so that it's no longer the case where any single person can say, well, I was just the engineer, or well, I was just a programmer, right? So everything is in context. There's always a bigger picture when every single one of us has to be thinking about that, and thinking deeply about how the things that we do in our work might have ripple effects beyond day to day.
So it's interesting that both Percy and Bistra, you both talked about the fact that we're not just engineers. We have to have all of the scrutiny. So let me ask all of you a question, and maybe I'll start with Sean and get to you. Is it time now for software development to be regulated, just like utilities or banking? Because it starts out with a very similar premise that you can't just be the person playing around with interest rates. You need to have an entire system that regulates you to make sure you do the right thing. Is it time for software to be regulated?
Oh my goodness, Arvind, you use the R word. That's a scary one, regulation. So I am a lawyer, but I'm a very pragmatic one, and my research interests go beyond just implementing laws, such that I'm hesitant to recommend regulation as a panacea solution. I do think that software needs maybe not regulation, but certainly more transparency. Sort of the kind of thing we've seen with the push towards the software bill of materials in a lot of programming now and IT products. So just like you want to be able to read a label for what's included in the food you ingest, I think there's value to knowing some aspects of what's in your code. Transparency to me is important, because if there are inherent biases, maybe it's useful to know who coded this system of features that will have social implications, right? I do a lot of work in the disinformation space as well, and people ask, should we have censorship in social media? Should we remove privacy in social media? And my answer isn't to hyper-regulate social media, but it is to provide provenance so that Russian actors can't pretend to be US voters and spread disinformation. Well, maybe in a software AI context, it'll be helpful to know where the algorithm was coded, whether it came from a corporate or a public interest entity, et cetera, et cetera. So my quick answer, Arvind, would be, I'm probably not in favor of regulation per se, but I do think there are other measures that could greatly increase transparency, and I would favor that.
Yeah, I just want to plus one the transparency. I think, I think it's important to understand that AI is very young as a field, especially the recent advances are just happened really in the last decade or so compared to materials and medicine, which have many years to kind of make mistakes and figure things out. So if you think about regulation, what would you even regulate at this point? The field is moving so fast. In my own area, machine learning and natural language processing, with the rise of these foundation models, which are these massive models, just in the last 3 years, I would say that the landscape has completely changed. It's just been blown away by the types of capabilities that are available. And you think about regulation and a lawmaker and how distant they are from the ground of what's happening. So I think it's a long process, but to prime that process, I do imagine that in the future there would be some regulation that would be appropriate, provided it's thoughtful. I think bad regulation could backfire and just have all the loopholes and hinder progress and all these things, which we don't want. But I think transparency is one critical thing that would at least help us understand what is going on. And once you know what's going on, then maybe we can talk about whether a regulation is appropriate. Another thing I like to think about is community norms, right? So this is like a much more agile way of thinking about what are the best practices. How do we release code? What kind of things do we document? Maybe when we publish a paper, not only do we see how good it is, but how robust it is, or whether it's biased. And a lot of things can be done bottom up from the research community. When you publish papers, you want to be attentive to these things so that in the community, if everyone's doing kind of reporting properly, then that kind of itself is a very powerful force, so that later down the regulation could be like, okay, do what already exists and we know to work in some sense. But I think, I completely agree with Sean that you have to be pragmatic. You can't just have from some law coming down from on high without being sensitive to what the realities on the ground are. And right now, I want to emphasize that it is really fast-paced moving, that there's no way that the time scale of how laws work can really keep up with what's going on.
Percy, if I may follow one thought on that, you pulled one thread, and I want to be even more explicit about it. The question about whether it's lawyers in Congress who aren't, technologists themselves, or whether it's community norms, we're approaching the question of who guards the guardians, the classic game theory question, and we're certainly not going to go down that rabbit hole here today. But if you are going to consider structure or regulation, the very first question you have to have is, who do you want to empower to be that regulator? And what is their requisite knowledge or expertise to actually play that role?
So just to comment on the community norms, like for me, that's, I think, one of the most important things, independent of regulation or not, that we really need to work to develop and flesh out and instill this culture. In engineering, there's this notion of what does engineering principles and responsibility, value human lives, you actually kind of have, or even in medicine, you have an explicit set of principles that people that are part of this profession really are ascribed to and think as representative of these values. And to some extent, computer science has fallen between the cracks. We are not really engineers, we are a standalone, and then there's no this explicit value system that is taught to our students, or generally is part of the profession. And it becomes really important to be thinking like that. I have a profession, I'm developing things that go out into the real world. What do I ascribe to? I want to do no harm, right? So then I have to be thinking about, am I doing harm with the things I'm doing? And so I think becoming more and more explicit, and as a community norm, expecting that of people being thoughtful and ascribing to certain societal values explicitly in their work, not only in their personal life, and thinking of their work as part of that system is going to be a huge step forward. And to me, now in AI, there's a lot of effort and a lot of awareness about AI and ethics, and there's a lot of push on the technological side to develop techniques that will help us interpret machine learning models, or techniques that are focusing on trying to detect bias either in the data or in the outputs of the model, etc. And that's great. There's still a long way to go, but as we develop these, we need to integrate these tools as, again, part of the community norms. If you're developing a system, an AI system, a software system, you do unit tests to make sure that it works properly. Well, I am hoping that not in the so far future, doing bias tests and fairness tests in machine learning systems will become like a unit test. You don't not do it. It's just part of in computer software practices. And again, this can be part of the community norms, and we have to work at developing them and guiding them and expanding them and growing adoption, and hopefully that will help to some extent in addition to regulation.
Yeah, some other examples are, 10 years ago, I think it was really not the norm for papers to publish the code or release the code that produce the results. But increasingly, that's been, actually, I've been very happy to see that a lot of papers, if not most papers, kind of release some sort of code, which helps with, the transparency angle that we're talking about. And this is just a norm, an example of an important norm that comes about. Unit tests and doing kind of sanity checks, as Bistra was talking about, are also good examples. And then the conferences. So NeurIPS is one of the key machine learning conferences. Recently, they have required papers to write an ethics statement, essentially describing the societal impacts of their work, whether there are any kind of risks associated with it. And that's another norm that I think will be increasingly adopted as just the mere act of reflecting on your work and what it's actually doing is going to hopefully make all the researchers in the community much more aware of these ethical issues.
One aspect that seems to have come out through all of your discussions is the fact that developers and engineers to be able to start to think about the social consequences of their work. So Bistra, I mean, being in an academic setting, how do you teach the next generation of developers and engineers to start thinking about social consequences of coding?
Right. Yeah. So I think we are working on, actually, and a lot of different universities are working on developing curriculum on AI and ethics. And, this has definitely become a topic that's very important. And so far, a lot of it's either like not part of it, or if there's courses and that is almost like an add-on course, like an optional course. But at least at USC, we are working on trying to figure out ways to develop modules focused on AI and ethics very early in the CS curriculum, right? As like one of the things you start hearing and thinking about and learning about in your first year. So it should become, in addition to like the more sophisticated technical aspects of it later on, but just in terms of the framework should be introduced really early on. So that's one way I think going forward. I'm hoping that this is going to become, again, the norm, that AI and ethics will be part of the introduction and throughout the curriculum be included in that. And many courses are trying to now include, in the context of different things, let's say you're teaching software engineering course or database course or machine learning course, should have a module on that. In my own work, I actually teach a course that is called AI for Sustainable Development, where I try to introduce students to the applications of AI in positive applications, like things like biodiversity, public health, housing allocation for homelessness, etc. And in doing that, we go through a lot of these case studies where AI has been deployed in settings of social impact. And there, on one hand is learning about the fact of these social problem domains and challenges. Second is understanding that AI can play a role there. But third, also analyzing how was this done, what could be the positive and negative effects, and learning about integrating stakeholders and different voices throughout the process. So really kind of teaching students to be global citizens, to be aware of the broader societal challenges and how their skills can help, but also learning about the process and some of the best practices in terms of how to do projects like that you cannot just like hear about the problem, take the data and just run and do something with it. That, again, end users and stakeholders have to be an integral part, from the problem definition to the data understanding, to the model development, to the fielding, and discussing and fine-tuning what outputs and uses should be at the end. So I think more courses about and teaching that will introduce the new generations of AI engineers to be thinking about their skills in context and in a diversity of contexts, as opposed to just teaching them the mathematics, the algorithmics, the programming part of it, is going to be really important so that they can have, practice and take those skills away with them when they go to their jobs and out in the real world.
So let me ask the harder question to Percy now and saying, should a computer science engineer who does not pass their ethics course not be allowed to graduate?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just quick to follow up to Bistra's. I think ethics has a positive side and a negative side. Negative side is mitigate harm. Positive side is kind of maximize social benefit. And I really like kind of the work that Bistra is doing, because it not just is about mitigating harm, but it's proactively trying to use the technology for good. I think both are important, but the former sometimes gets a little bit lost. And I also want to make another point about how important it is for ethics to be integrated, right? Not that there's an ethics class that okay, everyone has to do this requirement, and then once you take it, then, whoa, man, I'm done. I think, if you think about it, think about bridge building. It's not that you learn how to build bridges, and there's a separate class which is about how to build bridges that don't fall down, right? It's integrated into the act. And I think AI has to be, ethics has to be kind of thought about that way. Now, the problem or the challenge is that in computer science, if you think about deeply what is the thing that makes computer science powerful is kind of abstraction and modularity and these ideas where you can just work on sorting numbers and without thinking about how it's going to be used, because it can be used in anything, right? And that approach of kind of deliberately abstracting, hiding information. We think about software engineering as hiding, encapsulation. All those ideas, I think, almost kind of run in tension with the idea of being exposed to the end pipeline. So I think that's something that needs to be managed. I think you can have both. You can simultaneously think in terms of modules, but you also can kind of instantiate the actual applications. Now, maybe to answer your question, Arvind, a bit more directly, I think that to the extent that ethics is part of the curriculum, and if you are not doing an appropriate job, then yeah, I think that would just be, it's like if you didn't know any other sort of technical aspect of CS, it shouldn't be treated differently.
Sean?
Well, I find that discussion from our technologists fascinating, and especially your money question about an ethics requirement for earning degrees, Arvind. I actually want to expand this discussion a little bit further conceptually. What we've been talking about for the last few minutes are the ethical implications of AI applications. I want to point out that on one hand, we could also discuss the application of AI to ethical quandaries, right? I see great promise and potential for bringing less biased machine learning applications to weigh in on some of the very challenging ethical questions in our society or in global society, where we could hopefully move beyond our individual biases or our individual personal histories and limited knowledge of what it means to walk in someone else's footsteps if they have come from a very different socioeconomic, ethnic, national background. So I see great potential for actually applying AI algorithms to what have traditionally been purely philosophical or social or moral questions that were being decided by humans, and often humans from a very educational elite at selected universities or organizations. So that's on the one side. On the other side, and I don't know if Bistra's done work here or she may have knowledge in it, is the question of social disparity caused by access to AI. One of the things I've observed in my research is greater and greater aggregation and accumulation of wealth by a much smaller percentage of global society based on the ability to use AI and machine learning to further your capitalist interests. So if we have concerns about human security at a global level or about redistribution for social and economic welfare of less privileged individuals, there's actually an argument for making these very powerful AI tools accessible to all, even those who can't afford the access to that limited group of companies and research centers who are developing them. So quite frankly, the ethical discussions regarding AI can be along a very, very broad spectrum. So I don't know if we want to delve into either of those, but I just wanted to mention them for our audience because there's so many different aspects of ethics and AI that one could latch onto to have a fulfilling research effort or, indeed a career at this point.
Well, I think that was a great discussion. I do have one other question to ask you at the end, but I just thought this might be a good time for us to open it up to the audience. If anybody has any questions, please just put it into the chat box that you have, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to just add your questions and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But while you're doing that, I would want to ask all of you, it's like if you're now looking at a curriculum and trying to bring law and practice and social responsibility closer to technology and computer science, et cetera, should we then flip the entire discussion altogether and say, well, the kinds of people we start to put into these computer science and engineering professions should actually not, it's not about taking an engineer and adding ethics. Should that be part of the criteria of how you actually start to filter these people into the entire process? Is that how companies should be looking at, when they're hiring QA engineers or hiring developers? I mean, as opposed to sort of saying, we're going to take this group of people and make them a little bit more ethics savvy. This should become a primary criteria.
Well, again, it just, I feel like it has to be part of the education. Like we need to first work on ways of how to train and teach that. It's not like somebody has a talent for it, like, oh, I can sing beautifully, right? It's like it's something that you learn. But as I definitely think let's say it's like what Percy said, like it will be a skill set the same way that you have an exam of whether you know XYZ in computer science, you have an exam of whether you understand AI and ethics, then obviously it should be something that will be part also of the interview process of getting a job in the industry, right? If it is an integral part of our knowledge base as a discipline. So I guess that's my answer, is like, I feel like yes, but it also it's something that we should be able to have the resources for people to learn, right? And also internally to companies, this is something that they can invest in expanding education on those aspects and internal training as well.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, there is a sense in which everyone in CS should know some minimum level of ethics or have it kind of introduced into their thinking, just like everyone should take algorithms as a class at some point, even if their work is on visual design or something. I think it's just a kind of, if it's a part of the training of a computer scientist. Of course, there will be specialization, right? I mean, we can't expect everyone to have the same depth of as on the, let's say, the legal front as Sean, and also be a world-class engineer. I think that's just asking for the impossible. So at some level, companies do have to make sure that they have a diverse set of people who can span the expertise. But what's important there is that the team needs to be able to work together. It can't be like the engineers do thing, and then on the side there's a bunch of ethicists who are screaming, and then nothing. There's a huge disconnect. It has to be a bunch of people working on the same team. Just like if you're in software engineering, there's people working on the front end, people working on the back end, but together the system kind of operates as a whole. So you can have specialization, but they need to be able to talk to one another, and that's why everyone has to have enough training so they understand what the other people are saying.
So we do have a question from the audience, and so I just thought I'd jump in with that. I guess the question is, we talked a lot about minimizing bias based on programmers or data sets. What would be tangible ways that you would recommend that could actually be accomplished?
So I can start here. So the idea here is that AI is based on data, so biases in the data are important to keep track of. I think the first step is just to document the data. I think this often isn't underscored enough among machine learning people who say, I'm just going to grab data sets. I'm not even going to look at it. I'm just going to train a model and I'm going to see what it does, right? But I think one trend that has happened in machine learning is with these frameworks like data sheets for data sets is to carefully document what is in this data. Like, are there any biases? Is there toxic, content? Are there privacy violations? Are there did people give consent to give you? Are you even allowed to use this data, right? So I think the first part is just to understand the data, and then I guess after that point, there is a question of, okay, what learning algorithm or what machine learning model are training on, and I think there is a misconception that, well, it's all in the data. The algorithm doesn't matter because it's general and the algorithms are unbiased, math is unbiased, but there are choices there. There's a choice of what objective function you're optimizing for. You can optimize for the average case accuracy, which often means that the majority group tends to do really well at the expense of some minority groups. Or you can have these objectives which are optimizing for worst case group accuracy, where you're deliberately kind of upweighting the minority groups so that you can do well kind of on balance. So there are all these choices that go into actually of the training model, which have substantial consequences on the actual model behavior. And again, this goes back to a norm, right? The norm is to have these benchmarks in AI where you're just measuring average accuracy and you have these leaderboards where I'm getting 90% and someone else gets 91. But how is the 9% of error distributed? Is it distributed fairly across the population? That's often not even known. And I think so it's not just starting with the data and documenting it is great, but also paying attention to what objectives you're optimizing during the training of the model needs to be taken into account.
Yeah, I think Percy answered this question very nicely. I think that's the key thing is both documenting the data, also inspecting the data. We have some tools to see whether like the data is skewed in certain ways, etc. But then also a big part is really realizing that the modeling part, choosing what kind of ML machine learning algorithm and what kind of loss metric it's going to optimize for has a big impact. And also again, working with stakeholders to understand the value of different kind of mistakes, like in some settings, wrongly predicting, let's say you're doing a classification task where you're saying either positive or negative, right? Let's say a patient has cancer or no cancer, or I'm going to give this loan to this person or not give loan to this person. And in different contexts, making a mistake of the kind where you classify somebody as positive when they're negative versus a mistake where you classify somebody as negative when they're positive has different implications. One kind of error might have a much bigger cost to the person or thing that's being affected, and understanding those things and incorporating them in the metrics that are being reported and in the metrics that are being used to optimize or train the models is really important. So we can do things on both ends. And again, there's still a long way to go in terms of AI techniques that support this. But, we have some tools and some very smart people are thinking about it. And then the other thing is the explanation and transparency. A lot of the biases can be detected also if you spend time to try to understand what the model is doing to figure out some unintended consequences of like, okay, it's using, let's say, a combination of these two descriptors of the entity, but that doesn't make sense in this context, right? Or using, for example, features that are protected, like the gender of a patient, where it should not matter in the kind of context that you're predicting for. So.
Well, thank you. And I know we're slowly running out of time. So I did have one question to ask all of you, which is, especially as we're coming out of this webinar, what is one recent development that you are actually most excited about? Sort of an example, something that's happening in the field of AI and ethics, which the listeners and the audience can actually follow up on as part of their next steps, or in terms of this particular topic. And as experts in the field, what is the one thing that has come up recently that that you're excited about, and why? And do you want to maybe we can start in reverse order and go with Bistra, and then Percy, and then Sean.
Well, it's not a technological development. I guess I'm excited about what I was saying about the fact that there's a growing attention and growing excitement and value of integrating, thinking about AI in the context of societal impact, and like trying to both train as well as to encourage people to do research where they're applying it in real world setting. For social good, and that to me is very exciting, because for a long time, kind of even the reward system in academics, in AI academics, was very much focused on, can you generate an algorithm that's going to give the next state of the art? Can you beat 90% by 92%, right? And it was really work that was more on the, some people say, soft side, was somehow not encouraged or not valued as much. And so there's like this big push and this bigger and bigger contingent of faculty and students and people that are interested in working on thinking about AI in context, applying it, showing what it takes to actually work with stakeholders and with messy data and with very kind of messy applications where you have to think about who's going to get impacted. And actually we are starting to have the venues, the conferences, the journals, the all the other things that communities that are supporting this kind of work. And I think that's going to galvanize a lot of progress, right? The more we do it, the more we learn lessons, the more we expand our knowledge of pros and cons and best practices, the more we're going to enrich our discipline to be able to create those norms and best practices and make that an integral part of the way that we think about what it means to be an AI researcher or practitioner. So.
Great, Percy?
Yeah, so I'll point out one particular technical thing, which has, I think, massive social consensus, which is foundation models. So these are a class of machine learning models, language models, which are trained on massive amounts of raw data, text and images, and then they are able to do all sorts of downstream tasks. So examples include OpenAI's GPT-3 or DALL-E or Google's Palm. And one thing I want to emphasize why this is so important is that traditionally it used to be that AI worked by narrowly in domains. You would build a model for a particular domain for question answering, and then you build another one for machine translation, another one for summarization, and things were much more kind of self-contained. But this new type of way of doing AI based on foundation models means that you first train a huge model, and this is something that takes a team of 30 engineers and millions of dollars to train, and somehow miraculously it's able to do all sorts of different tasks and tasks that you haven't really imagined, and this is exciting from a technical perspective and scientifically really interesting, but it's also fairly scary from a social impact perspective. Just a few examples. Now these models can generate very fluent and believable text. So you could imagine misuse in terms of disinformation campaigns, or milder as spam and fraud and all these things, and that could be enabled and put on top of that images. And we already know about deep fakes, but this is like much more controlled generation where you can prompt it. I don't know how many of people have seen DALL-E. You prompt it with a natural language description and can generate an image of that. form. Soon, I think we'll be able to do videos. So this is very scary in the sense that it is an extremely powerful piece of technology that can allow basically people to generate, let's say in a few years, full fidelity videos of basically anything. And so the idea of like what's real and what's fake, I think it's really challenged in this context. And the fact that there's so much that we don't know about these models and how they work, but there's an incredible amount of commercial incentive to just kind of push and deploy them. I think this could be fairly risky and potentially destabilizing as well. And earlier I said that it's been great that AI has been blessed with having transparency and open source, but a lot of these systems are proprietary, and only a few actors can kind of train this. So I think the whole ecosystem is changing here, which I think introduce a whole host of new kind of ethical challenges that we need to really confront. So that's one of the things I'm really excited about trying to address in the coming years.
Thank you. And Sean?
Thanks. I'll link this to one of the questions we didn't answer that was submitted of, do we need AI? I'll say that certainly human beings lived before AI, but now that it's here, it's absolutely not going to go away, and we're not going to be able to forget about it. So from my perspective of most important developments as a lawyer and ethicist is, how are we publicizing the particulars of it, and how are we considering them beyond the purely technical measures that I think Bistra and Percy gave great examples of where the technical field is going. So two things I like events like this, and I welcome CEE stepping into this space to work with our community. But one from outside our community in the national security world that I do a lot of my work in was the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence that was created and convened by Congress. In its 2021 report, actually had a chapter entirely about privacy and civil rights and the implications of AI for that. I've just thrown that link into the chat space. But to me, that was among the non-technical developments, that was one of the most important in the last year. I know we've had European governmental reports on the ethics of AI in recent years, but I'm just going to give a shout out to the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which is a bipartisan and incredibly thoughtful report that also includes, I think its chairman and its vice chairman were very knowledgeable on technology issues as well. So I'd recommend that to everyone.
Well, I think we're on the hour, and I just wanted to, it's a good time for us to probably wrap up and really thank Sean, Percy, and Bistra for what I thought was a very cogent and very instructive discussion on the topic. And also thank you for, I know there were a couple of questions we did not get to. We will circulate them to the panelists and get back to you on some of these topics. But thank you all for joining the CEE webinar. I really want to thank CEE again for bringing everybody together, and for, as Sean said, wading into these kinds of areas. And I'm sure I echo everybody's feelings when I say that we should do more of these and really try to bring not just our community closer together, but also help people think about the next generation of challenges that are upon us. So with that, thank you all for participating and for your time. And thank you, Benny, for doing all the admin and the setup.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.